The wind howled across the empty plains as the sun dipped low, spilling red fire over the horizon. A woman stood alone by a crooked wooden fence, her black shawl clutched tightly around her shoulders as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Her eyes, once full of laughter and hope, now carried only sorrow. She had buried her husband not long ago, and with him, she thought she had buried her future. Each day felt heavier than the last, and the silence of her small homestead pressed down on her until it seemed to echo louder than thunder. The neighbors offered kind words, but none of them filled the aching emptiness that followed her from Falas. Sunrise to sundown. She told herself this was the end of her story, that her role in life was finished. But fate has a way of surprising those who have given up hope. In the stillness of one lonely evening, when the air was sharp and the world seemed to have forgotten her, she heard the sound of hooves. At first, she feared, unsure if it meant danger, trouble, or strangers who would only pass by without caring. Yet as the rider drew closer, something about the way he sat tall and steady in the saddle made her pause. His dark braids caught the last strands of sunlight, his face marked with strength and quiet pride. He was Apache, a man whose people were whispered about in stories both fearful and respectful. She had never spoken to one before, but something about his presence was different. He did not come with a weapon raised or with anger in his eyes. Instead, he carried himself with calmness, as if he had already decided he belonged here, standing before her at this broken point in her life. For reasons she could not explain, she did not step back. Instead, her grief and her weariness met his steady gaze. And in that silent exchange, the first flicker of something new stirred inside her, a spark she thought had died forever. Still, she had no idea why he had come. Was he a wanderer? A messenger? Or did he bring with him a promise she could not yet imagine? The world she knew had ended the day she became a widow, but perhaps this man carried the key to another beginning. The night deepened, the wind carried secrets across the land, and her heart beat faster as she realized her story was far from over. What the Apache would say next could change everything. The rider pulled his horse to a stop, the animal's breath steaming in the cooling air, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath with it. The widow stood frozen, unsure if she should speak first or wait for him to explain why he had come. Her hands tightened around the edges of her shawl, though not out of fear, more out of the need to hold on to something solid. The man dismounted slowly, his movements calm and deliberate, as if he did not wish to startle her. He kept one hand on the reins, the other free at his side, and his eyes never left hers. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, filled only by the rustle of the grass and the fading cries of birds returning to their nests. She felt as though the weight of her loss pressed heavier in the quiet, yet something about his presence steadied her trembling heart. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and even, carrying with it the strength of someone who had seen much, but was not easily shaken. "You are alone here," he said. Not as a question, but as a statement of fact. She swallowed hard, surprised that such a simple truth could sound so heavy when spoken aloud. "Yes," she answered softly, her voice rough from days of little use. "Alone." His gaze swept over the homestead, the fence in need of mending, the roof that sagged slightly, the ground that had grown wild since her husband's passing. It was clear to anyone that she had been left to carry more than she could manage. Yet he did not look at her with pity, only with a quiet understanding. She could not tell if he had come with an offer, a warning, or something else entirely. The widow had grown up with stories about the Apache, told in whispers around firesides. Some said they were fierce and dangerous, others spoke of their pride and honor. As a child, she had listened with wide eyes, never imagining she would one day stand face to face with one. Now, as the wind tugged at her hair and the last of the daylight slipped away, she felt the stories falling away, replaced by the reality of the man before her. He was not just a figure from a tale, he was flesh and bone with a shadow stretching long across her yard. She wanted to ask him why he had come, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she found herself studying the lines of his face, the set of his jaw, the way his eyes seemed to carry both strength and sorrow. There was something unspoken in his presence, something that told her he too carried losses of his own. Perhaps that was why he lingered instead of riding on. The man took a step closer, slow enough to give her time to retreat if she wished. She did not move. He tilted his head slightly, as though weighing her spirit. "The land is harsh for one person," he said. "It takes more than hands to survive. It takes a heart that still wants to live." His words struck deep. She felt heat rise in her chest, the sting of tears she thought had already dried. She wanted to tell him that her heart had stopped wanting anything the day the ground closed over her husband's coffin. But she said nothing, only held his gaze, as though daring him to see the truth inside her. The horse shifted, stomping softly against the dirt. The sound pulled her back to the moment, and she realized the evening had nearly slipped into darkness. She should have felt uneasy with a stranger so close to her home, but instead there was an odd sense of safety in his presence. She didn't understand it, and that made it all the more unsettling. He glanced at the small lantern flickering weakly near her door. "Night comes fast," he said. "It is not safe for you to stand in the open." Something in his tone suggested more than coyotes or wandering men. It carried the weight of someone who had lived by caution and had seen danger before others even sensed it. She hesitated, torn between pride and exhaustion, but finally she nodded. Without another word, she turned toward her cabin. She expected him to mount his horse and leave, but when she glanced back, he was still standing there, his eyes fixed on her small home as if measuring the life she had left. Inside, the widow lit another lamp and set it on the rough wooden table. The glow softened the room, but it did little to chase away the heaviness in her chest. She heard the horse outside, its steady shifting, and wondered if the Apache would ride on into the night or remain near. Something told her he was not the kind to wander without purpose. She sat down, her fingers tracing the edge of the table her husband had built long ago. Memories pressed in his laugh, the way his hands worked with wood, the quiet talks they shared by lamplight. She had thought her life would follow a clear path with him, that they would grow old side by side. But life had cut that road short, leaving her stranded with grief. Now, the sudden arrival of this stranger threatened to shift the ground beneath her once more. The night deepened, the cries of owls echoing across the plains. She blew out the smaller lanterns and left only one burning by the door. Just as she was about to draw the blanket over her shoulders and try to rest, a soft knock echoed against the wood. Her breath caught. Few ever came this way at night, and fewer still would knock. She opened the door cautiously, and there he was, the Apache, standing tall in the pale wash of moonlight. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes carried a quiet fire. "There are men nearby," he said simply. "They do not come as friends." Her heart raced, fear flooding her chest. She had heard of drifters who roamed these lands, men who took from widows and small farms without hesitation. Alone, she had little defense beyond an old rifle that she had not touched since her husband's death. She gripped the doorframe, searching his face for any hint of deceit, but found none. "What do they want?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. His jaw tightened. "What men like that always want? What they think they can take." The widow's stomach turned. She looked back into the small cabin, her few possessions laid bare, and realized how fragile her safety truly was. For the first time, she understood the weight behind his earlier words that the land was too harsh for one person alone. Still, she did not know if she could trust him fully. He was a stranger, someone her people had once called an enemy. Yet standing there in the night, he seemed less like a threat and more like the only barrier between her and the shadows creeping closer. The air grew colder, and the distant sound of laughter carried faintly across the plains. Men were out there, and they were coming closer. The widow's pulse pounded in her ears. She turned back to the Apache, her voice trembling as she asked the only question that mattered. What should I do? His eyes met hers, steady and unyielding, and in that moment she saw something that felt like both a warning and a promise. You must decide if you wish to keep living, he said, because if you do, then you cannot face this night alone. She stood in the doorway, caught between fear and the strange spark of hope he had lit inside her, as the shadows of the unknown pressed nearer. The night was not yet over, and neither was her story. The widow stood frozen in the doorway, the weight of his words sinking deeper into her chest. She had not asked for this night, nor for the dangers it carried, but life had never asked her permission before. The sound of distant laughter drifted again, sharper this time, cutting through the stillness like a blade. Her eyes darted past the Apache's shoulder toward the dark horizon, but she saw nothing, only shadows and the endless sweep of land. Still, his expression told her enough. He had lived long enough to know what danger looked like before it showed its face. Her hands trembled as she reached for the rifle leaning against the wall. It felt heavier than she remembered, the wood worn smooth by her husband's grip. She had not touched it since the day of his burial, when she swore she would never again need to raise a weapon. But the world outside her door cared nothing for promises made in grief. The Apache watched her quietly, his gaze lingering not on her weakness but on her choice to stand, to try. They will test your fear first, he said calmly. If they believe you are alone, they will press harder. But if they see you are not helpless, they may think twice. The widow swallowed hard, unsure if she could ever look convincing in her broken state. Yet she straightened her shoulders, forcing the weight of her sorrow to sit lower in her chest. She wanted to believe that she could survive one more night. The Apache's presence gave her courage, though she did not yet understand why. She asked, her voice quiet but firm, "Why? Are you here? Why help me?" For the first time, he looked away, his eyes narrowing toward the distance. The land remembers those who fall. I have seen many graves, many left behind. I do not want to see another. Something in his voice hinted at his own loss, a shadow she could not see clearly but felt lingering between them. She wondered who he had buried, what grief he carried that pushed him to stop here instead of riding on. His silence afterward spoke louder than any explanation. The moment stretched, heavy with anticipation. She thought of her neighbors miles away, too far to hear her if she cried for help. She thought of her husband, whose strength once filled this home, and of the emptiness that had nearly swallowed her since. Now, against all odds, she found herself leaning on the presence of a stranger, one whose world was so different from her own. The laughter outside grew closer, no longer carried by the wind but sharp and distinct. At least 3 voices, maybe. More. The widow gripped the rifle tighter, her palms damp. The Apache turned his head slightly, listening with the patience of a hunter. He spoke low, his voice steady. Do not show them your fear. Stand in your doorway with the lamp behind. You. Make them believe you are not alone. Her throat tightened. She wanted to ask what he meant, but before she could, the shapes emerged from the darkness, figures moving slowly across the plain, their shadows long in the faint moonlight. The men walked as though they owned the night, their steps careless, their laughter bold. The widow's pulse hammered in her ears as they drew nearer. She stood where he had told her, the rifle clutched in both hands, the lantern light framing her figure. The Apache melted into the shadows beside the house, unseen, but she felt him there like a steady heartbeat in the night. The men stopped a short distance from the fence, their grins sharp in the dim light. "Well now," one of them called out, his voice slick with mockery. "Didn't expect to find a lady out here all by herself. Nights get awful lonely, don't they?" Her stomach twisted, but she lifted the rifle just enough for them to see the barrel glint in the light. "This land isn't yours," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Best you keep moving." The men chuckled, exchanging glances. One stepped closer, dragging a stick along the fence post, the sound grating against the wood. "Pretty. Bold words for a widow," he said. "We heard you lost your man. Hard for a woman to keep a place like this on her own." The words cut deep, but she held her ground. She wanted to scream at them, to tell them to leave her in peace, but instead, she stood still, her jaw tight, her hands firm around the rifle. Behind her, the silence stretched, as if the land itself was waiting. Then, in one swift moment, the Apache stepped from the shadows, his presence unmistakable. He said nothing, only walked to stand a few paces behind her, tall and steady as stone. The men froze, their laughter faltering. One muttered under his breath, the unease plain in his eyes, "You ain't alone." "After all," the first man said, his grin faltering. The Apache's voice was calm but edged with warning. "Leave now. The night is long and you do not belong here." For a tense moment, no one moved. The widow felt her heart racing, but she kept the rifle raised, her body stiff with determination. The men hesitated, weighing their chances, but something in the Apache's steady stance broke their bravado. With mutters and curses, they finally turned back into the night, their shadows swallowed by the darkness once more. Silence settled heavy after their departure, broken only by the widow's unsteady breathing. Her arms ached from holding the rifle so tightly, and when she finally lowered it, her hands shook. The Apache did not speak, only stepped closer, his gaze steady as he studied her face. "You stood," he said quietly, as if it were the only truth that mattered. Tears stung her eyes, though she quickly blinked them away. She wanted to feel strong, wanted to believe she had faced them on her own, but deep down she knew she would not have managed without him. The knowledge was both humbling and frightening. She turned toward the cabin, her voice low. "Come inside. The night is not over yet." They entered the small home, the single lantern casting shadows along the walls. She set the rifle aside, her hands still trembling, and he remained standing, his presence filling the room with an unspoken weight. The widow felt the silence stretching between them, but this time it was not empty, it carried the weight of survival, of choices made in the dark dot. As she sat, she thought of the danger that still lingered beyond her walls. Those men could return, perhaps with more. She also thought of the Apache, whose reasons for staying were still a mystery. She wondered what brought him to her door that night, why he had chosen to stand beside her when he could have ridden on. Fire crackled softly, the only sound in the small room. She looked at him, searching his face for answers, but found only more questions. And as the night stretched on, with shadows pressing closer on them, the widow realized her world had shifted once again. The true danger was not yet over, and the promise of what was to come remained tangled in silence. The fire burned low in the hearth, its glow flickering against the walls like restless shadows. The widow sat at the table, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup she had not touched, while the Apache remained near the door, his eyes fixed on the darkness outside. Neither spoke for a long time, but the silence was not empty, it was charged, filled with the weight of what had just passed and what still lingered beyond the horizon. Every creak of the wood outside made her heart jolt. Every shift of the wind sounded like footsteps returning. She knew those men were not the kind to be turned away so easily. They had left because they were surprised, not defeated. They would come again, stronger, and perhaps not alone. She wanted to ask the Apache what he thought, but her voice felt caught in her throat. Finally, she managed, "They'll come back, won't they?" He turned his head toward her, his expression unreadable, but his silence gave her the answer she already feared. He did not soften the truth for her, and in some strange way she respected him for it. She had lived too long with neighbors who patted her shoulder with kind lies. This man spoke through honesty, even if the words never left his lips. Her chest tightened with dread. She thought of her husband, of how he would have stood tall in moments like this, rifle in hand, ready to protect their land. She was no longer the woman who leaned on him for courage. She was the one left to bear it. But as she looked at the Apache, tall and silent by her door, she felt a shift, a small, fragile sense that perhaps she did not have to face this storm entirely alone. The hours dragged on, the night heavy with waiting. At last, just when the stillness felt too thick to endure, the distant sound of hooves broke the air. Not one horse, but several. The widow's blood turned cold. She rose to her feet, her breath caught in her chest, and her eyes sought his. The Apache had already taken hold of his bow, his movements quiet and steady, as though he had been expecting this moment all along. Her voice trembled. "How many?" He tilted his head, listening intently, his sharp gaze fixed on the horizon. 4, maybe 5, more than before. Her knees nearly buckled beneath her. 5 men. 5 against her small rifle and his bow. The odds pressed on her chest like a stone, yet he did not falter. He looked at her, his dark eyes steady, and spoke with a calmness that almost startled her. "They do not know the land as I do. They do not know you are not alone. That is our strength." The widow swallowed, gripping the rifle once more, though her hands shook. Her heart pounded so loudly she wondered if the men would hear it as they drew nearer. She prayed they might pass by, but deep down she knew better. Men like that came for what they wanted, and they had seen her home. They would not leave it alone. The glow of lanterns appeared in the distance, bobbing with the rider's movements. Laughter carried on the wind again, but this time it was sharper, crueler, the sound of men certain of their power. The widow felt sweat bead on her brow despite the cool night air. She could not believe this was her life now standing on the edge of violence, her home no longer her sanctuary, but the center of a storm. The Apache turned to her. "When they come, stand with the lamp behind you again. Show them your rifle. Let them believe you have nothing to fear. I will not be seen until I choose." Her breath caught. "And if they don't leave this time?" He held her gaze, and for the first time she saw something flash in his eyes, something sharp, like fire caught in the dark. "Then they will learn that you are not as weak as they think." The hoofbeats grew louder. Dust rose in the distance, glowing faintly under the moon. The widow's legs trembled, but she forced herself to the doorway once more, lantern light spilling around her. She stood tall, clutching the rifle, her shadow long against the ground. Her heart screamed inside her chest, but she bit it down, holding on to the Apache's words. The riders came into view, 5 men, rough and wild, their grins bold. They slowed as they approached the fence, eyes fixed on her. One leaned forward in his saddle, mocking. "Told you she wouldn't last a night alone. Thought we'd come back and see if the lady changed her mind about company." The widow gritted her teeth, her voice firm though it cracked at the edges. "You've already been warned. Leave now." Their laughter rang out, cruel and mocking. One dismounted, swaggering toward the fence, his hand resting on his belt. "Warned? By who? You?" The widow tightened her grip on the rifle, raising it higher, though her arm shook with the effort. The man smirked, clearly doubting she had the will to fire. He took another step, the sound of his boots crunching the dirt louder than the pounding of her heart. Then, without warning, the Apache's voice rang out from the shadows, low and commanding. "She is not alone." The men jolted, spinning toward The sound. The one on foot froze, his smirk faltering. The riders shifted uneasily, their eyes searching the darkness. One spat on the ground, trying to hide his nerves. "So you got yourself a protector, huh?" he sneered. "Doesn't matter. There's more of us than him." But the Apache stepped forward then, out of the shadows, tall and unwavering, his bow in hand, an arrow nocked and ready. His presence shifted the air itself, no longer a quiet stranger, but a force that made the night lean toward him. The men stared, their bravado cracking under the weight of his silence. The widow felt her breath catch. For the first time since her husband's death, she did not feel invisible. She stood between danger and a man who had chosen, without reason, to stand beside her. The standoff stretched, the night holding its breath. The men glanced at one another, muttering, shifting uneasily. Yet the leader sneered, unwilling to back down so easily. "Maybe you scared us once," he said, his voice louder now, "but we don't scare twice. This land isn't yours. Nothing here belongs to you." The widow's pulse raced. The Apache did not lower his bow, his steady hand making it clear that one wrong move would end in blood. The men hovered on the edge of violence, their laughter gone, their hands twitching near weapons. The widow lifted her rifle higher, her voice cutting through the silence. "Then try to take it," she said, her words trembling but sharp. The men stilled. The air seemed to crackle, the weight of violence hanging over the land like a storm about to break. The widow's breath came quick, her finger trembling near the trigger, while the Apache's arrow gleamed in the moonlight, pointed steady at the chest of the man who dared step closer. In that instant, everything balanced on the edge of one choice, one spark. The night was heavy with waiting, and the widow knew the climax of her story was no longer distant, it was here, pressing against her door, demanding an answer. The standoff stretched into what felt like forever, the night air so thick with tension that the widow could barely breathe. She could feel the wooden stock of the rifle pressing hard into her shoulder, the sharp sting of sweat running down her temple. The men across the fence shifted uneasily, torn between pride and caution. The Apache stood still as stone, his bow raised, the arrow steady as though time itself had slowed to wait for his decision. The leader of the group sneered, but she caught the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He had expected fear, weakness, an easy prize. Instead, he had found resistance, two figures standing firm against him and the shadows he carried. Then it happened. Quick as lightning. One of the riders twitched his hand toward the pistol at his hip, but before steel ever cleared leather, the Apache's arrow shot through the night with a sharp whistle. It struck the ground so close to the man's boot that dust exploded upward. The rider cursed and yanked his horse back, the animal rearing nervously. The leader's face twisted with anger, but she saw it for what it truly was, fear hidden behind bravado. "You think this is over?" He spat, but his voice had lost its strength. "We'll be back. You can't hold this land forever." The Apache did not answer. He didn't need to. His silence was heavier than words, in his presence was enough to remind them that not every night would belong to them. One by one, the men pulled back, muttering curses as they mounted. Their lanterns bobbed in the distance until they finally disappeared into the darkness, leaving the widow's land quiet again. Her knees weakened beneath her, and she nearly dropped the rifle as the weight of the moment drained her strength. The Apache lowered his bow, the tension in his shoulders easing but not vanishing. He stood for a long moment, listening to the silence, making sure the danger had truly passed. Only then did he turn to her, his expression unreadable though. His eyes carried a depth that stirred something inside her chest. "You stood when it mattered," he said simply. The words sank into her, heavier than she expected. She wanted to argue, to say she would not have managed without him, But the truth was that she had raised her rifle, spoken her warning, and refused to crumble. Maybe that counted for something. She set the rifle down with shaking hands, her breath still uneven, and whispered, "I thought my life was finished. I thought there was nothing left to fight for." His gaze lingered on her, and for the first time she saw a gentleness soften the hard edges of his face. Life is not finished until you choose to stop living. Tonight, you chose. Tears stung her eyes, but this time they were not born only of grief. Something new pressed beneath the sorrow of fragile strength, small but real. She had thought her story ended in widowhood, but perhaps it had only shifted, waiting for her to find the courage to keep walking. The Apache remained with her through the night, silent but steady, a guardian against the darkness. She lay awake, staring at the low ceiling of her cabin, listening to the sounds outside, the creak of the windmill, the rustle of grass, and the quiet movements of the man who had promised nothing yet gave her more than she thought possible. When dawn finally broke, the sky painted in soft gold, she rose to find him standing where the horizon met the fields, his figure strong against the rising sun. The men did not return. Perhaps they would not risk facing someone who stood as firmly as he did, or perhaps they had decided her home was no longer an easy prize. Whatever the reason, the widow felt the shift in the air. Her land was hers again, not because it was free of danger, but because she had faced it and endured. Days passed, and the Apache did not leave. He helped mend the fence, his hands steady with the work, and together they carried water from the well, patched the sagging roof, and walked the land her husband once tended. At first, she thought his presence was only temporary, a kindness born of chance. But as time moved on, she realized he was teaching her more than survival. He showed her how to see the land as his people did, not as a burden, but as a living thing, one that could give strength if she learned how to listen. In return, she shared with him her stories of the man she had lost, of the life they had built, and the dreams they once held. The Apache listened without judgment, his silence never empty but filled with respect. She came to understand that he too carried ghosts, faces he did not name, losses he did not describe. Their griefs were different, but grief itself was something they both knew deeply. As the weeks stretched into months, the widow began to change. She no longer walked through her home as if it were a tomb. She planted again in the soil, mended what was broken, and found herself laughing softly at moments she thought would never come. Life did not erase her sorrow, but it grew around it, weaving threads of strength and hope through the cracks. One evening, as the sun dipped low, she stood beside the Apache at the fence line. The air was still, the land painted in the orange glow of twilight. She turned to him, her heart heavy with gratitude and something more difficult to name. "You gave me back my life," she said quietly. "When I thought it was gone." He shook his head slightly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I did not give it back. You chose it yourself. I only reminded you of what was already there." She felt tears sting her eyes again, but this time they carried a strange peace. For so long she had believed her story was over. Yet here she stood, alive, breathing, with a future she had never expected. The widow knew the world would not grow gentle overnight. Hardships would still come, dangers might still rise, but she was no longer the woman who waited to be broken by them. She was a woman who had stood with a rifle in her hands, who had refused to yield to fear, and who had found the strength to begin again. And though the Apache never promised her forever, his presence had given her something more powerful than certainty. He had given her the reminder that even in the harshest places, life could still bloom, and hope could still return to a heart thought lost. As the stars filled the night sky, the widow walked back toward her cabin, her step steady, the sound of his boots soft beside her. The land stretched wide around them, no longer empty, but alive with promise. Her life was not over. It was only just beginning again.